and get started with the next panel, which is mine, Critical Disability Theory. And I'm Rachel. And I just came from the banned books panel. I don't know if many of you were there at that one, but I feel like it follows on its coattails really nicely because we were talking so much about voices and stories being omitted from the mainstream, from being considered a part of the conversation of what it means to be in America, in a democracy. And regularly, and I'm sure I'm not alone, bless you, I've seen discussions of disability and the very many identities which fall under that umbrella being neglected in that conversation, often being rendered invisible, as many disabilities are, in fact, at least from our seeing day to day, but also omitted from the discussion of the vitality of individuals who identify with their disability or disabilities in our society and how they've contributed, how we contribute to democracy. So first, I want to talk a little bit about our terms. I hope that this is legible. I tried going a little mod with the black and the cream, but we will have quite a few videos to go with this that will hopefully complement. So there's a lot that could be unpacked with the term disability, and by no means will I be giving it its full justice due today. But I hope that we can make one shift in what I think is a common use of the term that will change this whole conversation. So often when we hear the word disability, we are talking about it from a dominant medical model, talking about the body as a site of a diagnosis, of something that needs to be cured, of a problem, be it a physical disability, neurodivergence, mental disabilities, yeah, I get a little loud. But I think we're all fairly familiar with this, the idea of the patient. When we have illness, right, temporarily it collides with this, and we are made often that kind of passive recipient, what can I do to fix this? But critical disability theory, which is what CDT stands for here, in part, just like other, like critical race theory, which is a very important intersection with this, which we'll talk about, but it takes into account the context around disability. That yes, there is, of course, real pain and suffering associated with different disabilities, and we're not here to undermine that. But a disproportionate amount of the suffering comes not from the disabilities themselves, but from the systems that label them. Ableism, effectively, is a cause of many suffering for those who have disabilities. And to take that extension, think about this. It isn't so much queerness or one's non-cis gender sexuality that is the problem, it's rather homophobia. And in the same way, it isn't the color of your skin or your race, the melanin that you have, but rather the racism, right? That these systems in place reinforce value, not well, politically and not wholly within our control, somewhat arbitrarily, on these different labels. And disability is no exception. And this is a powerful shift. Right? We could go into great historical depth about how disability is cast. I'm an English teacher, so in literary stories, particularly those of fantasy, disability is often a trope aligned with a character flaw. That's how you know a character is going to bring about something evil or devious in a story, is often something physically about them suggests they are not able-bodied. Obviously, there's some real problems with that, right? So, excuse me, thinking about how these ideas of disability are played out. What things are accessible to you? I mean, even this stage, we do have the ability, and we'll talk about why, these were not easy wins for those with disabilities that have come before us, but there is an elevator here. So someone who is using a wheelchair or needs other means of accessibility wouldn't have to rely on stairs to come up on this stage. But if you've never had that experience, which has brought some aspect of your body or your mind to the forefront of your everyday existence, you might not notice these kinds of systemic oversights that literally keep different people identify with their disabilities out of the conversation. All right, well, one more little consideration of this that I think is so powerful, and several very famous disability theorists have mentioned this. Everyone, if privileged to live long enough, will at some point experience disability. And that is a reality of our lived, embodied experiences. And so I think it makes it something, for many reasons, that we should all be invested in. So it offers freedom of our bodies in our bodies, a freeing paradigm shift in how we all view our bodies, minds, community, and interdependence, something we're wary of historically in American culture, that power of the independent individual who pulls himself up by their own bootstraps, when in fact we all rely on interdependence, and disability brings that often to the fore in ways that can make that individualist culture uncomfortable. And lastly, ableism is oppressive and limits expansive possibilities of liberatory change. So that's why we're here to talk about critical disability theory and what it can do to shake up those systemic problems. So I want to share this video with you. Sorry, I keep breathing heavily into this. I'm not used to using a mic. It is about 9 minutes, but it is taken from San Francisco University's is a virtual museum exhibit, so it is made accessible. We will say something about how the pandemic has helped us learn that having other options like Zoom and virtual meetings help more people at different moments in time make community, which is important. But it talks about a really rad democratic moment in American history and yes, in disabled people's history. And it is referencing section 504. This is of the Rehabilitation Act. This is back in the early 70s. It's the precursor to the ADA, which didn't come around until 1990. I'm guessing a lot of you might not have heard of this, but if you have, kudos. In large part, it's making it required that any institution that receives federal funds cannot discriminate against those with disability. That's where you get ramps and accessibility to getting into buildings, to getting upstairs. Very fundamental, but can you believe this is early 70s and this is a huge victory. These individuals, a collective of disabled people, different disabilities represented, staged a 26-day sit-in at a federal building in California. It was not the only sit-in by far, it was just one of the most dynamic of the bunch happening all over the country. And I just really want to preface our conversation with this so we see just how vibrant and a democratic group disabilities also encompasses. So, let me cue this up, hopefully.
A white man signs.
This is 504.
He holds a faded, torn poster. All persons with disabilities. The federal government is trying to steal our civil rights. Demonstrate to demand signing of 504 regulations. Words appear. The Paul K. Longmore Institute on Disability at San Francisco State University invites you to discover a remarkable overlooked moment in U.S. history when people with disabilities occupied the federal building in San Francisco for 26 days to demand their civil rights. A black and white photo of a black man slides left and is joined by a video of the man.
It was just a great time, a moment in history.
Words appear. Known as the Section 504 sit-in, the protest profoundly changed the lives of people with and without disabilities and paved the way for the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, in 1990. A black and white photo of an Asian man in a wheelchair, a color photo of him laughing.
The plan was originally for the demonstrators to be outside. A few of us were to go in and make appointments. And when the time came to leave, we didn't leave.
An empty chair by figures sleeping on a mattress on the floor. Vintage color footage of the marchers outside. The occupiers inside. A hand-lettered sign, support, not sympathy. A photo, a video of a white man. He signs.
We live here. We are part of your world. We exit.
And they realize that this is a time where they can actually have some kind of empowerment, where they can actually say to the government, we're not going to take the kind of standards that you've given us before. There were no ramps for disabled persons at the time. There were no elevators for the disabled. We would like more a piece of the American pie.
This is the first time that I've come out in a real public way and said, hey, no, I don't accept that. No, I am not second class and I don't accept that.
Are we going to perpetuate segregation in our society? We're one of the largest minorities in this country.
I can tell you that every time you raise issues of separate but equal, the outrage of disabled individuals across this country is going to continue. It is going to be ignited. There will be more takeovers of buildings until finally maybe you begin to understand our position.
A black and white photo of a white woman with glasses and dark wavy hair.
People had been waiting since 1973 for the regulations to be issued.
On TV.
Instead of giving in, they move in what will become the longest occupation of a federal building in U.S. history. 504 means access to public transportation and public spaces. It means free public education and no job discrimination. All basic American civil rights. Proud and defiant, 500 to 600 people in wheelchairs with walking canes and hearing aids storm the regional office of Health, Education, and Welfare in San Francisco. Their purpose? To stop discrimination against the disabled, no matter what the consequences.
There were huge windows in the federal building, and there were people signing the press releases on one side of the windows to people who would re-sign them on the ground to make sure they got it right. That's the way that I know that we got the press releases out.
On TV.
Here is being brought over by Delancey Street. However, the Salvation Army has not been able to come up with blankets or cots, that sort of thing, so they are still frantically out looking for that.
The regional commissioner's office got turned into the refrigerator because he put the plastic over the air conditioner, draped it across the room over a table and down in front of the table. And so underneath was freezing.
And the Black Panther Party was there every day, bringing us really good food and settling disagreements amongst the people that were getting frazzled and worn out and stuff.
And we had an understanding that our oppression was not the only form of oppression in America.
I think this is going to end up being an historical event for the country and beyond that, because this is whether the Montgomery actions of civil rights movements, our Stonewall and gay rights movements, and so on. This is the event in which disabled people said that we would assert our rights.
A photo of a white woman with light brown hair.
It wasn't typical for people with developmental disabilities and mental health disabilities and all these various disabilities that had not necessarily worked together before to really come together on one issue.
I feel real good because it's like all this anger that I've had is finally making sense and it's being turned outward where it belongs into changing things, and that feels really strong and positive.
We were not the poor people to be kept in somebody's basement. We needed to be proud of having disabilities.
A blind white woman.
And being fully functional, not overcoming disabilities, but rather having disabilities and being fully functional human beings. And that we could show the world that.
On TV, victory for the disabled.
Tonight, 35 million Americans are no longer second-class citizens. Regulation 504, what is being called a Bill of Rights for all of this country's handicapped, has finally been signed by HEW Secretary Joseph Califano.
Secretary of HEW Joseph Califano called them the oppressed and hidden minority.
Vintage footage.
The new rules will usher in a new era of civil rights that will change the face of America, starting with such things as curbstones at intersections. Programs in virtually every institution that receives government funds must be made accessible to the handicapped within 2 months.
We show strength and courage and power and commitment that we the shut-ins or the shut-outs, we the hidden, supposedly the frail and the weak, that we can wage a struggle at the highest level of government and win.
The protesters leave the building.
We thank all of you who supported us from the outside, who worked so hard also. And I might add, the struggle has really just begun. There's so many more things we're going to have to deal with in the future. And this coalition is a part of a national movement, and we're going to stick together and continue to fight for our civil rights.
Every person in that building was making a sacrifice in one form or another, and I think what came out of that was people realizing that in banding together and working together, you can get much more to happen than if everybody individually is trying to do something.
People will accept us now, keep the movement alive. I think, you know, if we don't keep pushing, you know, people will forget.
Vintage footage, a hand-lettered sign, Rights for the Disabled, sign 504 unchanged. A woman dances with a man in a wheelchair.
Okay, and this is from, as I said, a virtual exhibit housed at San Francisco University called Patient No More, which is a wonderful double play on meaning, right? Patient, as we mentioned earlier, that customary role of, from the medical model of one with disability. You'll give me just a second to leap back in this. But also referencing things like Dr. King's discussion about waiting and being patient for change and how that is such a fallacious way of approaching this. Echoing the sense of all of different civil rights movements, that no longer would these individuals be passive recipients to conditions, but be active in making change. So a few things, and again, we'll have some time at the end. I hope that I'll get to hear some of your thoughts on that, especially if, for instance, Section 504 or that particular sit-in was news to you, the importance of making that kind of history visible. But I want to build on a few more points first and save us the time at the end. And also, I have at the end a QR code that you can access all these videos and resources should you want to look those up, delve a bit deeper. I would love that. So my idea for this is to build on this as a kind of collage of voices, so importantly neglected, being given a space and opportunity to share experiences. So one of the points that we got from that very important historical moment was one of intersectionality, which if you've done any sort of studies in civil rights before, you're probably familiar with the term, but the idea that each and every one of us is an intersection of different identities. So when we talk about racial injustice and we talk about sexual orientation injustice, we talk about disability injustice, there is inevitably an overlap, and there's a power in acknowledging that. And disability is no exception. And I think one of the best placeholders for that in that film, I love that moment when they mentioned the Black Panthers were coming daily and providing food and helping to keep morale going, as this was a kind of act that they were familiar with as an organization, and how they were seeing the different kinds of oppression aligned, right? That there is a power in that. So too often when we do talk about the intersections of otherness and difference that receive discrimination, disability isn't featured prominently or is often left out entirely. And again, it's a very broad category. So I wanted to play this quick video for you from the Ford Society, where Carrie Gray discusses her identity as a Black disabled woman and mentions how Black Lives Matter has recognized that, how our most vital movements going forward for change have to reckon with the intersection of differences, which always include disability.
My name is Carrie Gray. Carrie Gray is a Black disabled woman, and there's power behind that. In the United States, 1 in 4 in the Black community have some type of disability, whether that's visible or invisible. Historically speaking, organizations and institutions have shown us that they want to identify with one thing and build power around that, build influence and access. And I get it, right? So this idea that you have disability rights, you have women's rights, you have LGBTQ rights, and those kind of different pockets are really building a strong narrative. But the thing that I find to be harmful is when we're not building in coalition. Because the reality is that you have people like myself who are Black, disabled, and women, and so many other things. And when you live at the intersections of all 3 of those, then you can't split your political and social dynamics between these different groups. It doesn't produce real results of freedom, and it doesn't produce real results of access to employment and other opportunities that you're looking for. I'll give one example on this. So the Black Lives Matter movement. When it was created in conjunction mostly with a lot of young folks. What was unique about this particular movement was the intersectional philosophy that was built upon. The folks getting up and saying, we are not just fighting for one narrative, but we are specifically fighting for folks who are on the margins. We are fighting for Black folks who are also LGBTQ, who are women, who are femme, who are trans, who are disabled. They named it. They saw like their people across the country and said, I'm fighting for all of you. Not just some of you, not just the ones that have traditionally gained power and access. And that gives me a lot of hope, because no one wants to be left behind. My name is Carrie Gray.
Sorry, I'm not gonna start that again. But I thought it was powerful to have, again, a voice of an individual with this lived experience, giving us a sense of the power of intersectionality here, and how we should be talking more about disability and disabilities when we're deeply invested in social change and really investing in our democracy. So in the spirit of that, I have just some more ideas I want to share with you. This actually comes from Dr. Amy Kenny's text called Disability Justice in the Church, My Body is Not a Prayer Request, which regardless of your faith standing, I think is a really important passage to say and to remind us of the microaggressions that those with disability, particularly ones that can be seen, are confronted with daily. And there's a history there, right? As though something, and we mentioned earlier in the history of fairy tales, problematically, how a character flaw was often represented by a physical disfigurement. And unfortunately, there is a residue, there's a legacy of that, of seeing wrongness in someone, and a fear in able-bodied normalcy of that being a possibility. So these are just more ideas to build on the power of critical disability theory, this lens of the social construction of disability. Constructing buildings and communities with disabled people in mind from the outset produces a culture of belonging that does not discriminate against bodily differences. Again, going back to the idea that it is ableism, it is the inability to see disability as an embodied reality for many, and to take that into account when creating spaces. You naturally put those outside of that community if you're making it hard to enter a building, right? I mean, that's a very fundamental fact. The public space disables my body, but it could be restructured or reimagined in a way that includes wheelchairs or cane users like me. So again, the idea of disability as a social construct in large part, that is up to us as a society to reshape and broaden who we allow access and include. And not all disabled people are in pain. Not all suffer from our bodies, but all of us suffer from the society that mocks or limits those bodies. It's a powerful thing to sit, and for some of us, that's a very real reality, and for others, this can be a bit of a wake-up call. Another phrase we often hear is people, particularly with disabilities that present, right, non-invisible disabilities, embodied disabilities, bring with them a host of questions. And some of our theorists, I love this line I pulled, the question mark that is my body. What does it happen when your physical embodiment becomes a curiosity to those around you that needs to be understood and discovered, made sense of before you as a person can kind of be seen? This is a common phenomenon, and again, another example of how our sort of systemic view of ability and disability limits people far more than any personal disability concerns. I have a quick poem that I would like to share, excuse me, called The Daily Commute. And she gives such a powerful voice to just the experience of going to work daily on a bus and the kind of microaggression she encounters with an ableist lens. Thinking about, well, we watch this, people often ask, why are you disabled? How did this happen? When will it get better? It's again from that problematic medical lens of like, what's wrong with you? What would it take to fix? I do think a lot of times these come from a well-intentioned place, but you can see how that could make a person feel very much like a problem before a whole human being. And this powerful question, does my body need a name for you to include it, learn from it, love it? See it as a full person with dignity.
I sit at the stop, fumbling with my coins, hoping for exact change, a quick transaction. Here it comes, approaching with a fresh wave of anxiety. I ascend up the ramp. Oh wow, look at you, you've sure done that before, as if I did it to impress. And before I even got my hands on the ticket, it rolls off his tongue. So, what happened to you then? This week has consisted of 3 bus rides, 3 drivers, all quoting the same script, hoping for a tragic tale followed by a heroic overcoming of adversity, except I was born this way. He tells me that's a shame, and I want to tell him that if it's a shame, it's one that I've carried since birth, and that I'd be confronted with it every single time a stranger requests my history. But instead, I turn up the corners of my mouth and say, nah, not really. But at least you've got a beautiful smile. The smile I'm forced to wear in order to prove that my life is worth living and that my rights are worth fighting for. Tired, I wheel down the bus, cutting through the passenger stairs like the knife of the surgeon who told me he was going to bring me one step closer to normality. But the hard work was up to me. This sure feels like hard work. I put in my earphones and put on my brakes, 20 minutes on the road, waiting for my heart to stop racing. As we approach, he lets me know that the ramp isn't working, asks if he can give me a hand. No, it's okay. I've got it, I guess. I step down, dragging my chair behind me. Oh, wow! You're full of tricks, aren't you? Skills traded as tricks, built by necessity in a world that refuses to take notice. It's as if all they want to see is struggle, sugar-coated as inspiration, but I've got to bury that frustration because at the end of the day, he's just trying to be nice. They're just trying to be nice. Nice like the day he wishes me as I wheel away.
All right. So again, please, I hope we'll have an opportunity. I wish we could unpack these a bit more with our time here together. But holding that in your mind as we continue into this next screen, sorry, I keep having to do this here, where I want to talk about a very important aspect of disability, and one that I even as we're talking here, going back and forth, you may have noticed this. Now, you may have heard of person-first language or identity-first language. 2 options really available when talking about disability, and you can see them actually bleed into, I think, other ways of talking about difference and identity. I feel like a lot of us in the more contemporary moment are comfortable in the first column here with person-first language, but I hope by the time we leave today, you'll be a little more wary, a little more open perhaps to finding out each individual you know, how would you prefer to be called? Where do you identify? So the person-first language is language that puts a person before their diagnosis, such as being a person with a disability, a person who is blind, a person who uses a wheelchair, a person who has autism. And obviously the pros of this, and I think the good-natured part of it, is that it's trying to reinforce the person over the disability. And in a society that has historically viewed disability as a mark of inferiority or weakness, as problematic as that is, this sort of steers people away from seeing disability as the primary signifier for that person. But you can already see some problems in this, I think. The cons, it treats disability as a negative thing, as a shameful or lesser part of an identity, as though a person should want to have that separation made. And many individuals with disabilities do not feel this way. So it does seem to come largely from an ableist perspective of like, oh, there's this thing that's different, but it's almost like the answer to color blindness within disability, right? Like, I don't see race, I don't see color, I like people. We know that may be good intentioned, but it's not accurate. It's not fully honest and authentic, and we're moving away from that. And the fact that disabilities are not necessarily deadly or contagious. People do not need to be cured of them. In fact, a person cannot be separated from their disability, and many would rather not be. But this is something the ableist society makes presumptions about. So identity-first language, alternately, is language that leads with a person's diagnosis, such as being a disabled person. And in this case, it conveys a disability as being a permanent and important part of a person's identity, as part of their dignity. They lay claim to it, and there's agency in that. For instance, the blind, deaf, and autistic communities see their disabilities as being fundamental parts of who they are. For instance, the deaf community is very adamant. I'm talking about as though there's one singular deaf community, so bear with me here. But there's a very, I'm not sure I'd say vocal minority. See, we have these built-in ableism in our own language. But that the deaf individuals, they have a deaf culture. They have language. Why would that need to be something you wouldn't part of your identity? Just as much as you might mention, I'm a white woman, I'm from Missouri, I'm deaf. So taking a kind of authority and agency in that. Cons, of course, it may cause people to think that a person's disability completely defines who they are. And this is especially problematic when some people's views on disabilities are based solely on negative stereotypes, which we certainly suffer from at this point in time. So this is a complicated incident, and this is taken in part from a self-advocate, and he mentions his own perspective on this, which is really powerful. And what I think we all need more of is to find out what individuals feel for themselves. But I have this linked at the end if you'd like to investigate that further. I know people going into education, in particular, healthcare, this comes up quite a bit, but really it's relevant for all of us. Now, this also leads into something I really want us to talk about when we mention disability, and it's inspiration porn. The idea that those with disability are somehow meant to be symbols of overcoming, of coming back from worse than, for an ableist society, being mascots in a sense, of having stronger character, all these sorts of narratives. And I think I mentioned in the description to this very event, and you've probably seen the billboard, though I'm aging myself a bit, with Christopher Reeves, Superman. He did in fact play Superman, but this is more referencing his quadriplegic lifestyle afterward and being an advocate. And again, these sometimes come from a very well-intentioned space, but what does it do to the person that's the recipient? How it might objectify them, make them an object to make someone else feel better. So I want to play this clip. This one is a little bit longer, but again, I think it's important to hear this from actual experiences rather than have me simply tell you their definition. So see what you think about this. I have a feeling you know this one pretty well yourself.
Hello, my dears. What's new in your lives? I know I made a video like a week ago, but I haven't really sat down and made a video in like a while, so if this comes out really horribly, I'm sorry. For those of you who are new here, hi there, my name is Sydney Zerlingo. I use she, her pronouns. I am autistic, disabled, and gay. My favorite color is buttercup yellow, and I make educational videos as well as vlogs because I'm currently in conservatory in Italy, and also music things, because I do music things. And speaking of music things, in case you aren't subscribed or just didn't notice, I released a new music video like Wednesday. And I spent 6 hours laying on a stone floor for that music video. So for my sake, please go watch it. Also, it's just a really great song. And there's also some other things that you're gonna know about shortly. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, today's video is about inspiration porn. So, step 1, what is inspiration porn? Inspiration porn, coined by the Australian disability advocate Stella Young, is defined as the portrayal of people with disabilities as inspirational solely or in part on the basis of their disability. Typically, inspiration porn stories have a one-dimensional disabled character or person in real life, and they simply exist as a catalyst for a non-disabled person's success or inspiration, heroism, what have you. Examples being those stories in the local news praising a non-disabled student just for asking an autistic kid to prom, a disabled person being excessively praised for simply existing, and or the character in the wheelchair who inspires the main character to go run a marathon and win it because the disabled person made them realize how lucky they are. Whatever. And before we go into the reasons why that is harmful, I want to be fully transparent and say that I used to like these kinds of stories. And we'll talk in a bit about how easy it is to just say, all of this is bad, and not realize the nuance and the important pieces of it. But I just want to say that it is a normal human emotion to find joy in these things and to like fluffy, feel-good content. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. You are not a bad person for consuming this kind of media. It's just important to be mindful of the effects said media has on our outlook of the world and how we perceive others. You feel me? Now, the inherent issue with inspiration porn is the overall dehumanization of disabled people, which it does in several different ways. So we're going to look at some specific examples and break it down. So first is the thing where the non-disabled person asks the disabled person to prom, or is just generally a decent human being to the disabled person. And that kind of story teaches people that they should be nice to us out of a desire to be praised for that, rather than as a desire to see us as equal humans. So all of the support that they give us is just hollow and insincere, because people don't want to actually be an ally. They want to seem like a good person for being an ally. And on top of that, if you constantly see stories on the news praising somebody for basic human decency to a disabled person, you would assume that that is the exception rather than the rule, and that you're therefore allowed to be horrible to us, which is like simply not the move. There is a mosquito, hello. Now, if you're thinking, okay, but nobody was gonna actually take them to prom, so shouldn't they just be happy that they were asked, and you know, it's a cute story, so can't we just enjoy it? And so we're gonna do a little thought exercise here. Now, imagine that you were born with, say, 3 arms and blue skin. Got it? Cool. Okay, so you're used to being left out of things and ridiculed and therefore you don't have many friends, and you're pretty wary of people. You hear that prom is coming up, but you don't expect anybody to ask you because, well, you got 3 arms and blue skin. But then a random person that you have literally never spoken to in your life comes up to your lunch table with all of their friends and asks you to prom. And everyone else claps, and somebody's live streaming it for some reason. How would that make you feel? Precisely. Another inspiration porn thing that you see in the news a lot is the whole, this middle school robotics team made a wheelchair for a disabled teacher, which should strike you as icky from the beginning, because, I mean, what does that say about our healthcare system that somebody relies on a middle school robotics team for, you know, a mobility aid that they need to function? But cool. But also because, again, the disabled person is completely decentered in this narrative. And the story is about the middle school robotics team. The disabled person is just a byproduct, a catalyst for the sake of a feel-good story. And again, not the move. And then we have the, you're an inspiration, here's an award for just existing. And you may be thinking to yourself, okay, but that doesn't exist. In which case I suggest you go watch Wonder and then come back to me. But like, imagine if every time you opened a door, everybody applauded and cheered you on. Or every time you tied your shoes, or went up a flight of stairs. I cannot express how incredibly annoying and belittling that is. And on one level, I'm not gonna lie, it's nice as a disabled person to have people acknowledge that something can be hard. For example, as I mentioned earlier, I'm at a physical theater conservatory right now, and a whole lot of the work that we're doing in class is essentially a sensory nightmare. And it genuinely does mean a lot when one of my friends sees how hard that I've been struggling with something and how hard that I'm working on something, and they tell me that they're really proud of me. I mean, yes, I'm doing the same thing everybody else is, and I'm probably doing a significantly less good job of said thing because of the barriers that are just getting me to even be able to be in the classroom. But in all honesty, it does feel kind of nice to be acknowledged. But it's also important to recognize how much better it would be if, I don't know, the space were actually accessible and inclusive. Like, sure, I'm proud of myself for doing a neutral mask exercise without having a panic attack, but it would have been a whole million times better if there was instead an option for a sensory-friendly mask for the thing, so I wouldn't have had to have the first 2 panic attacks in front of my entire class in the first place. I am resilient because I have no choice. I either do the sensory horror or I fail the class. Like, yes, I'm really brave for what I'm doing and for being here and for doing this, but I shouldn't have to be brave all the time. I should be able to get through a school day without having to use so much courage that I get the shakes. There's obviously some serious systemic issues with that type of education system. Now, I understand the desire to see resilience. I mean, there's something innately beautiful about seeing somebody against all odds succeed. Because, well, we see that and we think, well, if they can get through something that difficult, then so can I. And again, in all honesty, I see pictures of other disabled people getting married and having kids and thinking, wow, despite all odds, they made it, so I can too. And this includes stories of people who are told they're never going to walk again and then running a marathon, or somebody coming back from addiction even stronger. I mean, there's just something so hopeful and pure and good about that, in knowing that humans are capable of that kind of resilience and can still succeed. But the issue here is twofold. One, these stories typically decenter the disabled person that they're talking about, and two, we're being called inspiring for being resilient in navigating a system that is designed for our exclusion instead of, you know, holding the system accountable for making it exclusive and then making said system more inclusive. It also creates a dichotomy of, well, the poor disabled person can do it, so why can't you? Or, well, I saw a Paralympian with cerebral palsy get gold for track and field, so why are you still in a wheelchair? It continues the idea that a person's disability is their own fault, and that if they tried hard enough, they could just miraculously fix it, or that all disabilities are one monolith. It also completely invalidates our own struggles. For example, I know several autistic people who love doing neutral mask work, which means that a teacher might look at me having a panic attack on the floor and say, you know, I get that you're having a panic attack, but these other people with the exact same disability as you are having a great time, so I need you to pull yourself together. Rather than, okay, how can we make this easier and more sensory friendly for you so that you can actually learn and thrive in this learning environment rather than just suffer? But again, let's be honest about it. A lot of what I'm saying is very theoretical and impractical. I mean, if you were to cut out every inspiration porny story from your media consumption, you would likely not see any disabled representation. Non-inspiration porn representation is very few and far between, and you would probably miss having all these stories about resilience, and you, as a single human, aren't going to miraculously change the entire systemic issue by no longer consuming inspiration porn. So all I ask is that you're critical with your media consumption, and that, well, you take a moment to think, is anybody, being completely dehumanized by this story before you share it? And maybe don't tell a random stranger on the street in a wheelchair that they're inspiring for getting out of the house. A general rule that's really great is disabled person doing something cool, inspirational. Disabled person doing something regular and boring, not inspirational. But also, if you know somebody well and you know that it's hard for them to do a specific, regular, boring seeming thing, and that they've worked really hard at it, you are so welcome to tell them that you're proud of them and that you see how hard they've worked. Just make sure you're being a good ally and trying your hardest to make said thing more accessible for them if you can. I feel like I've talked in circles for this entire video because all of this can seem very logical and black and white on paper, but then you bring it into the real world and examples and feelings, and then it gets all mushy and confusing again. So in an attempt to summarize, please treat disabled people like regular, normal people, be wary of media that doesn't do that, and do what you can to make the world more accessible for other people. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, your story isn't over, it has only just begun, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.
All right, so I'm interested here as we have a couple more slides, but wrap up and hear your thoughts on these. I really liked how the speaker touched upon the nuance of inspiration and how we can find joy in others' achievements, but also being wary of how we're casting a person, particularly a person with disability, if we're simply seeing them as an object in a narrative, or rather seeing them as a fully dimensional person. How you can do advocacy and just not perpetuating those particular inspiration porn examples. So these last two slides that I have for us are just, as I said, this is just offering a panoply of ideas here, but it's important that we touch on certainly disability pride and the intersection of fluid sexualities and disability, sexuality itself often being taboo with disability for a lot of problematic reasons, as though those with disabilities are meant to be asexual. This goes back to a lot of concerns about contagion, the concern of sharing difference, some really disturbing, we can go a lot of directions with that I would rather not, but reclaiming that. July is actually the month of disability pride, and this is actually the symbol of these very dynamic lightning bolts with choice of rainbow colors. I have a link at the end if you want to investigate further the symbolism in that. I also mentioned crip theory here, and I want to use the word crip and bring that to your attention in the same way that the word queer has been reclaimed by the queer community. Crip has been reclaimed by those in disability, a term that was long used as a pejorative one, and instead using it as a radical way to lay claim to disabled identity. So if you're interested in more of that, Robert McWhorter, I have more of that here at the end, but crip theory is at radical edge and does talk about a lot of the overlap between disability pride, disability, and sexualities, reclaiming that on a very radical edge. And I thought we would mention what the meaning of pride. We hear pride used certainly in claiming proudly an identity that has long been denied someone. And I thought this was powerful from Eli Clare, another amazing activist and scholar in disability studies. Pride works in direct opposition to internalized oppression. The latter provides a fertile ground for shame, denial, self-hatred, and fear. The former encourages anger, strength, and joy. To transform self-hatred into pride is a fundamental act of resistance. And that comes from his text, Exile and Pride, Disability, Queerness, and Liberation. We're getting into that. All right. One more spoken word piece for you that is so incredibly powerful that I'm going to move it to my resource page, and I would love if there are any questions or comments, just thoughts from y'all as I've been talking at you, and also sharing a lot of voices, just to open up your mind to what critical disability theory is and how it can really broaden sometimes our narrowed notion of what democracy is, particularly for those who identify with disability.
The parents of autism speak, say disease instead of neurodiversity, fix instead of adapt, cure instead of survive, exterminate, test before birth and abort, take Tesla AC current, take dashes of poetry from Emily Dickinson, take Einstein's theory of relativity, say vaccine instead of genetic inheritance, problem instead of child, autism tries speaking, shuts down before speaking, gets shut down before speaking, tries counting odd numbers, counted as odd number, autism says, leave me alone, gets slapped in face, told for your own good, show me a talent or show me an institution, speak up, stop speaking, speak up, why are you speaking up for yourself, go play with the other kids. Why did you play with the other kids? It's your fault for picking a fight, for looking for trouble, for speaking. Were you not paying attention? Stop speaking, stop eating, stop stimming, stop crying, stop existing. Your purpose is to be pitied, be a poster child, a donation jar, raise money to find a cure or find a test, abort this mistake, wipe us out before birth, keep the good parts. This isn't complicated. Keep the good parts, get rid of the bad parts. You are the bad parts, your work is the good parts. Just let us use you. Let us use you. Friends of autism speak, say high functioning, say that's a compliment, say give me a hug, takes a hug, gives chew toy as present, says, chew on this, get out of your head. Say, look at me. Why are you looking at me? It was just a hug. Don't answer. Don't answer. I said, stop speaking. Were you not paying attention? It's puzzling, isn't it? To be a collector's item for social justice, a demon child in some parts of your own country, a Nobel Prize in retrospect, and a nuisance to everyone else. Autism tries speaking, has tried speaking, tried to diagnose itself, show that this existence is worth it, this disease, the hand of Midas, turning anything it touches into gold, a curse, turning anything it touches into gold. Dear Autism Speaks, when you find the cure, don't call me first.
So I've just, as I promised, listed the resources that I've used here, including links to the clips. This is just the title, but if you are interested, I do have this QR code, which links to a Google Doc that has them all hyperlinked there. So you can go visit any of those videos again, maybe explore more from any of these activists that we've shared today. And I also want to plug Thursday's presentation at the 11:30 time slot with Paige George, who is expert on all things concerning disability here at the college. She will be presenting on the ADA with a student panel, and it definitely builds on this, so I think it would be a great one to invest your time in as well. Now, if there are any questions or ideas folks have that have come up during this panel, I would love to hear it. In the spirit of Democracy Days, it isn't merely about one person or a few up here speaking, but about the voices of the people. So, any hands? Any ideas? Don't feel put upon. Yes? Yes, absolutely. So I'm just going to amplify what you said, because we're talking about mental health, and absolutely this, I will say, this discussion isn't terribly not exhaustive. When we talk about disability, it is such a broad range, but absolutely mental health is included, such as concerns of depression, anxiety, yes. And I do think we're, as a society, becoming a little bit more openly vocal about that and aware of the impacts of those and their prevalence among us. But absolutely. Because that also can stem to concerns in the classroom, right? Something relevant to us here. If your mental health isn't being taken care of, it's very hard to expect of you to build upon that higher order, like being concerned about intellectual ideas in a classroom. So absolutely. Did you want to say more to that? I didn't mean to cut you off. Or... Yes. Yes, and many... Yes, because there's sort of a taboo around it still in the same way, right? Like you should manage that depression, cheer up, or anxiety, just take a deep breath, calm down, which is someone who admittedly has been diagnosed with anxiety and medicated. That does not work. And I think you bring up another excellent point. If you think of the image of what disability is, the universal sign is actually, I wonder if we had one around here, of the blue with the white individual on a wheelchair, right? Even that is such an interesting, that symbol is used for a vast amount of disability. And some folks takes issue with that as well. There's actually a movement toward having a more dynamic looking wheelchair, because it looks like a passive agent. And that might seem like a small thing, but these narratives run deep. And there's a real collective action to try to shift that. So thank you for bringing that up. Yes, sir. Yes, yeah, so that first clip what we watched, the news media clip, was actually from 1978, I believe, when they finally got Section 504 passed for the Rehabilitation Act, which was originally from 1973. And I do think, I'd be curious to know if that's something that many of you were familiar with historically. And then building on that, of course, the ADA, which comes out in 1990. 26-day sit-in at that time, the longest that had been sustained in a federal building. Sort of a substantial thing, right? And I think extremely important, particularly in light of talking about disability, because of all these false assumptions of disability as being a weak, passive, immobile, fragile, all of these sorts of associations, but seeing dynamic individuals who identify with disability, all manner of disabilities, holding a federal building hostage until it does what it's meant to do. Did you want to say more to that, or just wanting to bring that up? I'm glad you did. Yes, so it opened the way. It's very, I had it pulled up on my phone to read. It's very vague. The Section 504 is basically saying anything that receives federal funds can't discriminate on basis of disabilities. They have to make things accessible. But a lot more of legislation had to be passed after that to specifically address. So, I mean, it was a huge thing, but as very often in our democracy, it was a first step of many. And what you're talking about, other kinds of measures, like in schools, those were still a developing legislation. And like I said, this goes through into 1990 with the ADA, and we still have issues. I mean, you still have privately owned buildings, things like that. There's no real way of reinforcing a lot of it. There are also not a lot of people going around and checking on this. So it may be in law, but who's reinforcing it is problematic. Did you want to say something, Michael?
I wanted to ask what novels you might recommend that would bear out some of what you're saying. If you've already mentioned it, I'm sorry. I had to step out to take a phone call.
No, you know what? What might be easier, because I have pregnancy brain on top of everything else, is if I could add the list to this, because I mainly look, these are like theorists and poets, but in terms of like fictional novels, I could get you a good list, because one of my favorite advisors, who's listed on here, has a collection. But I feel bad, but off the top of my head, I'm right now panicking and to give you a full list.
No,
but
that's
absolutely,
all right.
because that goes perfectly on our conversation, right? Of sharing of narratives and stories from the perspective of disability. And a lot of YA pieces too, with autism.
What's that?
YA novels. There's been a
Yes.
wonderful upsurgence in that intersection of autism and sexuality. I will add that to the list, though.
Reason I ask is I remembered something that happened years ago in the classroom. I taught the novel Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, and it's not specifically about disability, but when the American family is in Africa, they're in a village, and one of the people that they see in the village on a regular basis is a young man who's missing most of his arm. And people will say hello, and he just unselfconsciously waves his stump at you. And my disabled student, who was in a wheelchair, she had all of her limbs, but she was in a wheelchair, and spoke of how refreshing it was that was just not a disability moment, it was a human moment. And I've remembered that ever since.
That's so beautifully put too. That's it, right? Is looking at disability not as a negative or a positive, but of a neutral part of human experience, and then engaging it as such. And now that you've mentioned that, I did put this on the tail end, lest we have time. Just 2 slides. I have them here, and I was like, I don't know if that might be overdoing it, and I wanted to leave time for folks. But many of you may be familiar with Peggy McIntosh's famous essay, or really list, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And the idea of it was to say, here, white reader, these are the things that you can take for granted that a black reader or a person of color would not. And in this same spirit, Dr. Amy Kenny, one of the texts I earlier referenced, has created a kind of ableist privilege knapsack. Not exhaustive, but one to consider if you don't identify with disability, how these may be things that you take for granted that a person who does would not, and how that can really open your eyes or your awareness to how prevalent ableism is. Things with not being treated as a question mark, again, your body, or what's wrong with you, why are you behaving in this manner, but things like being able to sit with your friends when you go to a concert or a performance. Trusting that there's always going to be a public bathroom that you can access and use. Protected by minimum wage laws, and I will say there's some push too about to collect disability, there's a real deterrence from those with disability, collecting disability, to get married, because when you do, you often lose that right to collect disability, and so in a way it deters those with disability from having a spouse. There's a lot out there yet to be addressed legally in this realm. And I think too, like you said, the individual was able to wave his arm nub, like it was just a natural part of his body. Also, people not asking to play with your limbs or accessories. If in fact we are all a bit cyborgs at this point, right? But those with disability, physical disabilities, that may be more apparent, needing different kinds of utensils to make things accessible. I don't know, I just wanted to have those up there as something to think about. And there'll be, I'm sure, more perhaps you have experienced or that you could add to the list. But again, just the goal of extending these great moves. We're in the moment in a time of paradigm shift. I really think we are, where we're confronting a lot of under the rock injustices our country has nurtured against its lip service it's given to democracy for many, many generations. And let's not let disability fall to the wayside here, but see it as a very vibrant intersectional part of those oppressive systems that we're working to change. And we're working to include more humans in this human experience. So that's really all I have for today. I appreciate you all coming and listening here in the dark to me and all these important voices. And again, I would just urge you to, if you would like to check in on that, I'm going to make this an ongoing list. I love the QR codes resurgence, and I'm trying to take full advantage of it. So thank you again. Consider coming to 11:30.